Our first speaker of the day to kick off this stage is a principal consultant at Empathy Software, loves working with the tech leaders to help them build high-performing teams and shape architecture. Let's welcome Nick Toon.
What could be more unique and exciting than a conference at a railway museum? A train museum, a conference in a circus at a train museum. I think that's pretty unique and exciting. But my wife is getting curious about all these conferences I'm going to, so let's not go too far next year, Craft Conference, yeah? Let's keep it sensible. So today's talk, Independent Value Streams. If you've been to Manuel's keynote, if you're familiar with team topologies, if that interests you, we're going to be talking around those topics today. But before we get started, just like to invite you all to just take a quick moment to think about your career and a turning point you may have had in your career. Don't need to speak out loud. Don't need to talk to the person next to you. Just take a few moments now, think in your head. What was a key turning point in your career?
Quitting.
Pardon? Quitting. Whatever is important to you. So the reason I've asked this question is because in this talk, I'm going to talk about a turning point in my career. I just wanted you to remember what it feels like when you have one of those big moments, just to try and so you can understand what I was feeling at these points. So the turning point happened in 2016. I was hired by Salesforce, one of the departments that were partly based in London, and basically the way it worked was we've got some legacy systems, some old monolith, and it's tightly coupled, and we think that domain-driven design will help us to create a nice, loosely coupled architecture. And there's this book about DDD, and Nick Toon's name's on it, so we'll hire him. No interview, pretty good salary. When can you start? Oh, great. So the first thing to take away from this talk is, just because someone's name is on a book about something, it does not mean that they are an expert about that thing. Continue to apply all of your normal recruiting and filtering processes. So that's the first pro tip from this talk. Someone's name on a book doesn't mean anything. By the way, I just spent the last 3 years working on a new book. There was a project during the pandemic, had a bit of spare time, so I thought, yeah, I'll start working on another book. It was a lean pub book to start with, but this one's different. This one contains a lot of industry examples from other people. I've got a lot of their expertise in there, so it's not relying on my knowledge. There's a lot of great case studies in there. I've got some voucher codes to give away. I've got 3 voucher codes for Manning, I think, so anyone who comes up here after the talk, you can have some voucher codes. So let's get back to the story of this talk, and let's talk about this turning point. So it's 2016, I'm working at Salesforce, and there's this kind of situation here. This is my diagram of a tightly coupled monolith. My friend James thinks it's a cookie. Every time I show this picture, he always says, "Why have you got a cookie?" I haven't seen any purple cookies, but if you've seen a purple cookie, please send me a picture, and I'll give you something for free. But, situation we've probably all been in our career, legacy monolith, difficult to work with. You make changes in one part of the code base, break things in other parts of the code base. The whole thing has to be deployed together. Every team's involved in the deployment process. A lot of manual testing, no test coverage, developers tripping over each other. So that was the problem. So it was a typical kind of situation. What we wanted to get to was using domain-driven design to identify good domain boundaries. If we identify good domain boundaries, then our software will be more loosely coupled because it aligns with the business. But we had this classic pattern here where the domain boundaries we wanted to have didn't align to the technical boundaries. The way the business thought about domains and subdomains and the way the software was shaped around different concepts, are completely different. And so the problem with this approach is when you want to implement a feature in one particular subdomain of your business, you're touching multiple different parts of the code. That's what we mean by coupling. So the solution we're kind of looking for is if we can identify good domain boundaries, if we can use concepts like DDD to think about how we model our business and we align our software with those domain boundaries, when we're implementing a new feature in a subdomain, we'll only have to touch one part of the code base. So we'll have much looser coupling in the software and in the business. Obviously, this is a very idealistic scenario. It doesn't always work this way. We always will have some dependencies, but good boundaries in both of these aspects can help us to reduce a lot of that coupling. But was this the solution? No, it wasn't, because even if we would have aligned the software with those domain boundaries we identified, we still had another part of the puzzle that wasn't obvious to me. This is the turning point in my career, basically. It was the teams. We could reshape the software to look like the business domain, but we still had teams aligned to the old technical boundaries. A lot of you might think it's obvious now, but at the time, it was like a head-exploding moment. How can you be a software architect if you're not allowed to reshape how the teams are organized? And when I spoke to the bosses in that part of Salesforce, they were very reluctant to do that, and for good reason. They'd spent probably a couple of years or maybe more at that point, building these teams. They had these teams who'd been working together. Each team had a manager and a principal engineer. Teams are working well. And this new guy whose name's on a book turns up and starts saying, yeah, you need to start messing all your teams up and stuff. He's like, no, I hired you for the software bit, not the teams bit. But this is the turning point, like it's all coupled. You can't really touch one without the other. So that was the big moment. And I guess what we're trying to get to nowadays is these three different components. If we're architecting systems, it's the teams, it's the business domains, and it's the software. We need to try and get all those things aligned. I think nowadays this is quite an obvious thing, but back then to me it wasn't. So that was 2016. In the months and years after that, I was thinking about this concept a lot. It was really challenging all my thinking. I was listening to other people, writing blog posts about this topic, starting to use the phrase socio-technical architecture. Just what do we call this? How do we think about this? And I wasn't really seeing anyone who was putting these dots together. It seemed like you had the organization and teams over there and a bunch of different people talking about software architecture over here. And it's like, I've just had this big breakthrough moment, and yet I can't find anyone else who's connecting these dots. And it was in 2019 when Team Topologies came out, and things started to become a bit more stabilized, a bit more connecting these dots together. And in Team Topologies, you're probably aware of the concept of a value stream or a stream-aligned team. A value stream's a pretty simple concept. It's the steps a team goes through to deliver new value. So figuring out what's a problem our users have, defining a small slice of value, and implementing it in software, deploying it. I'm simplifying the process a bit, but that's the idea. We try and deliver these small steps of value or learning as often as possible. Good teams are deploying multiple times to production per day now, and that's what we call fast flow. And so over the last couple of years, I think this concept from Team Topologies has really started to bring these different dots together. And for me, this concept of independent value streams, I now see this as the building block of modern architecture. If you're architecting systems, I think these four pieces, if you get these four things lined up, you'll be able to design much more loosely coupled systems in addition to the teams as well. So the first aspect is the domain-aligned part. The second is outcome-oriented. We'll talk a bit more about that shortly. The third one is team-empowered. If you want to have a value stream with fast flow, if a team can make decisions faster without needing help from outside the team, the flow will naturally be faster. And we also need our value streams to be software decoupled, as we talked about. So in this talk, I'm going to go through those different aspects of an independent value stream. It is a bit of a high-level talk. I am trying to connect lots of dots. It doesn't really go too deep into any of these concepts, but I have written about all these concepts in more detail elsewhere. And I'm always happy for any feedback. For the first few minutes, I'll hate you, I'll be all defensive, but then a couple of minutes later, I'll be really grateful for the feedback. So in person, email me, always appreciate any feedback. So let's get to the first part, domain aligned. We want our value streams, our independent value streams, to be set up to deliver value in a particular business subdomain. We start with these business subdomains. And so, the air show's starting now. Should we go outside and watch it? What time are the Lions coming in? They told me about 20 minutes into the talk, so we've got a few minutes to go yet. But basically, first point here, I think modern architects, because we need to have these independent value streams which are aligned to business subdomains, modern architects must be skilled at finding business domain boundaries. But that's a problem, because it's not easy to find domain boundaries. If you look at this example here, we've got these different abstract concepts. If these were concepts in your business, how would you organize them into different subdomains? We can organize things based on shape, based on size, based on color, based on weight, based on other properties that we can't see here, maybe like the material. So it's always a very subjective approach. We need to understand what are the different options, and that's where a good architect knows about different heuristics for defining business subdomains. So the heuristics aren't that complex. I think it's just knowing about them. First one, very simple. We take some process or user journey, and we just chop it up into different steps, and each one's a subdomain. Placing an order, we've got search and browse, product details, cart and checkout, reviews. They could potentially be your ideal subdomains. But we also need to look at other heuristics as well. What other options are out there for ways we could shape our system? Second heuristic is where we start to centralize common concepts. In this example, each of these different process steps involve the concept of notifications. We could extract that into a separate subdomain all about notifications and remove any concepts related to notifications from those other subdomains. Here's another scenario. We've got this concept of a customer in these different places. We could extract a separate customer subdomain or customer domain. But I would typically advise against this. This is one of the things, as a consultant working in the domain-driven design space, whenever you hear the customer domain or the customer subdomain, you're like, oh, it's happened again. So we need to be careful about centralizing some concepts. Typically, the customer domain or customer subdomain brings a lot of things together. Anything related to a customer gets dumped in there, and they become monolithic. So what we can do is we can apply a different heuristic to help us think about what's right in this scenario. In this example, we can look for where the business, where domain experts used specialized terminology in different places to describe this abstract concept. In this example, we have marketing. Here, they don't talk about a customer, they talk about a lead. Well, they might talk about customer, but they also talk about lead. We've got this more specialized word that's hinting at a possible domain boundary. In this subdomain, we think about them a lead. So it's about what's the purpose of that subdomain, and what role does that concept play towards that purpose. In the journeys, it's about getting a person from A to B, so we call them a rider. So language is a clue for our subdomain boundaries. And fourthly, we also have roles in our domain. I don't know how many people played the game Lemmings in the 1990s, maybe the 1980s. You had all these different lemmings, and you gave them each different roles. You know, one could just stand there acting as a wall. It's kind of like that when you're modeling business subdomains. In this example, we have 3 subdomains: building a campaign, advertising campaign, running a campaign, and campaign optimization. And we can see that each of these subdomains has a very distinct role. Building a campaign is about building a specification, a description or some instructions of what you want to happen. I want to run an advertising campaign targeting these kind of people. I'm prepared to pay this much. Here's some other criteria. But at that point, the thing you want to happen hasn't happened yet. You've just described what you want to happen, a specification. It then gets handed over to the campaign running. Its job, its role, is to take that specification and execute the process and to carry out the instructions that you want to happen. So 2 very different roles here. Specification, build up some description of what should happen. Execution, make it happen. And we also have other roles. In this example here, we've got analysis. This kind of subdomain is characterized by taking in lots of different data and producing some insights. For example, your ad campaign's not performing well. Why don't you try tweaking the audience or the time you're running it, that kind of stuff. So those are 4 different heuristics for finding domain boundaries. There are many more out there, but as an architect, it's good to know about all of them. It's good to first think about what are the different ways we could shape our domain boundaries in our organization. If you're not familiar with techniques like event storming, then for me, those are essential these days. It's very easy to look at a business at a high level, look at some product or process and think, yeah, we can organize the domains that way. When you do a technique like event storming and you get deep into the details, you bring different domain experts together, you learn about a lot of the nuances of the domain you're working in, and that can have a big impact on your boundaries. I took this picture at a conference called Como Camp. It's an unconference. If this kind of idea is new to you, collaborative modeling, I recommend checking it out next year. So let's move on to the next step. Outcome-oriented. An independent value stream needs to be outcome-oriented. We're talking about business outcomes here. Revenue, customer acquisition, conversions, customer lifetime value. A value stream is not something where we pass in requirements and the team delivers what they've been told to do. That's a feature factory. For a value stream to be independent, teams need to be able to make decisions about what they're going to build. So this quote by Anna Kennedy is a great point that I think is something that reflects a lot of the work I do. Very simple idea. There's no point having a tech strategy about reducing costs if the business strategy is focused on creating new products. So as a consultant, I often get to see different parts of a business. I'll talk to people who are more engineering focused, and they'll say one thing, and people more in the product and business side will say something different. I recently worked with a Scandinavian company, and the CTO and some of the chief product people were like, the company wants to double revenue in the next 5 years. We've identified some major growth areas. We see that this industry is opening up massively, so many opportunities. And I talk to the engineers and I say, so what are your plans for the next couple of years? And they're like, well, if we could hire 1 or 2 more people, we could fix a bit of technical debt quicker. And I'm like, over here, they're talking about doubling the company revenue in 5 years. And yet over here on the engineering side, they're just looking for some small incremental updates. It's just, no, they're not aligned there. So we need to know what are the business outcomes we're optimizing for. And so I think architects are good at that. A modern architect needs to know what are the outcomes we're optimizing for, and how does each value stream fit into this portfolio? What's the role of each one? How do we invest appropriately? And that can even have a big impact on the boundaries you're creating. One of the simple techniques I'm often using just to start these conversations, it's very easy, is Anzoff's matrix. Basically, you've got products and markets. Markets are the people you're targeting who currently use your products. And you can talk with different people in your company and say, what's our growth strategy? Are we building new products for new people? Or are we just going to continue to develop our existing products for our existing customers? So where in this grid are we? And that can have a big impact on your architecture, on all your architecture decisions. So here's an example from the BBC. So at the moment, you probably can't see that, but basically these lines are a bit faded. But these are the verticals at BBC: children's, education, home, youth, sport, and weather. That's how they've organized their domain boundaries, their software boundaries, and their team boundaries. That's what their company looks like. But now they're starting to ask some questions. We can see these concepts like topics and search and articles appearing in our different domains. Should we apply that second heuristic and extract those into a common platform? Well, they did, but what's important about this is the reasoning. We're not getting too much insight into what they were going through inside the company, but we can clearly see the outcomes they're optimizing for and how they made this vital architectural choice. So if we look at the bottom of the quotes, they want to build more innovative features for the audience. So they're not trying to reduce their costs here. They want to be an innovative company. And they've chosen to create these horizontal value streams because they believe that those concepts are commodity. Those concepts are standardized concepts that are very similar across the different verticals. So we do have a lot of duplication here that's not adding value. If we can centralize, it's going to help us to innovate faster and free up those vertical teams to deliver those custom innovations. So they know what outcomes they're optimizing for, and they're making architectural choices based on that. I haven't worked with BBC. I don't know if it was a good choice to do that, but this is the thinking. They knew what the outcome was, and their business outcomes were driving these architectural choices of domains, teams, and software. So if you're an architect and thinking about your company as a portfolio of domains and value streams isn't something that you're comfortable with or have done before, it's actually not super difficult. One of the techniques I recommend coming out of domain-driven design is the core domain chart. This can help you to map out your different subdomains which your value streams are aligned to and start asking questions. So which of these areas are we focusing on over the next couple of years? What's the key to our growth? And does our architecture and the investments we're making match up to that? I'm not going to have time to talk too much about this technique for now, but there are some resources online. I think it's a really useful technique. And there's another reason that we want to be outcome-oriented, as I mentioned before. We don't want to be in this feature factory mindset. And this quote from Marty Kagan, I totally agree with this based on my personal experience, but there are some nuances. And basically, what he's saying is, if you're just using your engineers to code, you're only getting about half of their value. And what he means is, engineers understand what's possible with technology. Engineers are able to solve problems creatively. So if you get your engineers more involved in building the products, you'll develop better product and feature ideas. And I think this quote is almost 10 years old now. If you go to product management conferences, it's almost a foregone conclusion nowadays that having your engineers involved in product discovery is the best way to build products. So that's why we need these business outcomes. If we want to unlock the value of teams, a team is aligned to a value stream, and a team needs to be given business outcomes that they're optimizing for. So let's move on to that topic, and let's talk about teams. So I think that a modern architect is just as focused as on setting up high-performing teams as they are on shaping software architecture. I'm not saying an architect needs to be involved in every single aspect of building teams, but they need to know what a good team looks like and know when they're making decisions that has an impact on how the team works. And here's one of the activities I often use in my workshop. It's designed to provoke a conversation. It's not a great question, but you can see the idea, right? So we ask people, what's more important, having a great architecture or having teams that are motivated and empowered to make decisions? And when I do these workshops, we've got a mix of people in here. We've got technical people, architects, product people, sometimes CEOs and CFOs. And this is what I see in most of the time. Most people are much more towards the team side. So if you're an architect and you're looking at this, if you're only focused on the software and the architecture, you're in the bit that people think is the least important. The biggest impact opportunities are over here. I'm not saying one's more important than the other. I never get involved in this myself. I never put my opinions on here because it's a stupid question, but just to provoke some conversations and get this idea teased out of people. So if you're an architect and you're wondering about where are the teams I'm working with, what are this journey they're going on, I also use this diagram by amplitude, and it talks about the different levels of empowerment a team can have. So another activity is I ask people to put 2 dots on here. Where are you now, and where would you like to get to? So if you're not familiar with this, it's basically each of these is kind of a step in a process or a value stream, how you build products. In the old waterfall days, every step in the product development process was owned by a separate team, and there was a handover, and we know why that doesn't work nowadays. On the bottom row, the product team, every step is owned by a single team. All of these decisions about what to build, how to build it, when to deploy it, these are all within the value stream. And so I think this diagram is a great visual guide for thinking about how do we get to an empowered product team, which is necessary for independent value streams. And you can use this with your organization to have those conversations. If you're looking for something a bit more concrete that you can apply to your architecture, then I find independent service heuristics from team topologies to be very useful. It's basically a checklist. So you can take your architectural decision and you can go through the independent service heuristics, and it will help you to assess different aspects of your architecture. I did a talk on this last year with Matthew. You can watch the full talk. But here's one of the insights we found working with a client in America. So the client was looking to set up a platform. They were trying to do that extract into a common subdomain. And was it a good idea? Was it going to work in their company? So from a technical side and a domain side, everything looked great. You would definitely say it's a good architectural decision. So now we start thinking, will this work from a team and an organizational perspective? And so there are these 2 heuristics in the ISH. There's cost tracking and product decisions. And as we went through these 2 heuristics in particular, we started to notice a problem. That basically this horizontal platform team would not have their own dedicated budget. And that meant they could only build exactly what the vertical product teams would pay them to build. So they didn't have much autonomy, and that would force them, you're basically outsourcing. They can't do what they think is best for the company. They're just simply a feature factory. So with the ISH, we surfaced this problem, and we were able to raise that concern. Very long story, lots of interesting twists and turns in it, so can't go into all of that now. But if you're thinking, domains and business outcomes, I'm good at that stuff, but the team stuff, that's my weakness, I think you can pick up a lot of the information you need from these four books. I think they're all 4 great books, which talk about these different aspects of empowered teams. And also going to product management conferences, you'll pick up a lot of these concepts as well about modern product development processes. And I think, doesn't Craft have another conference, something about product management? Anyways, the final part now of independent value streams is the software decoupled part, the part you're probably most used to. But I think when we talk about decoupled software, when we talk about loosely coupled architecture, we have a problem already with the terminology. And what I'm seeing nowadays is architects who are able to discuss dependencies. So I had one client recently, and I did a workshop with the developers in different teams. And one of the biggest problems was, in my team, we've got our priorities, but we also have other teams asking us to do work for them. I don't have an unlimited amount of time, said the tech lead. Like, what should I do? Be selfish or be helpful? That was his dilemma. And so we got the CEO of the company into the room, and we asked him, which of these things is preferable to you? And he went, none of them. He went, you should redesign the architecture in a team so that there are no dependencies. It's never going to happen, is it? But actually, some people do think that way. So we need to have a vocabulary, a richer model for talking about coupling to identify which dependencies are more painful and more costly than others. And it just so happens, if you were at the conference last year, my friend Vladik was talking about this. He's currently writing a book about coupling. And he gives us this formula. It's not exactly scientific, but it gives us a model for having conversations. So for every dependency, we can work out the pain of that dependency, and this applies on a team level as well, not just software. The pain of a dependency is the strength times the volatility times the distance. So I'll talk about strength on the next slide. Volatility is basically how often the two things change together. You might have a very hard dependency between two components. If they don't change very often, it's not a problem. Distance is about what's the distance conceptually between two concepts that are coupled. If you've got two variables in the same method, minuscule distance. But if you've got two different bits of code in two services owned by two different teams who operate in two different countries, in two different time zones, we've got quite a big distance there, and we can say that dependency is probably likely to be much more difficult. So the strength one I find is interesting. And the problem I have when we talk about coupling in software, an example from a recent workshop I was in, developers would say, we're trying to get a loosely coupled architecture, and as soon as there's any coupling, he would say, no, there's some coupling there. We can't have that, it's coupling. Like any time there was coupling, it's like bad, coupling bad, conversation over, we can't do that. But these integration strands are a great way for talking about those nuances. So the strongest form of coupling is what Vladik calls intrusive. I think he's still iterating on these names, so this might get out of date soon. But the idea, I think the concept is basically there. Intrusive coupling is when one component knows a lot about another. And the consequence is, whenever this component has to change, there's a high likelihood that it's going to break this one over here because it knows so much about it. Functional coupling is where the business rules in one component of your architecture. When you change them, it could break those in another. Model coupling is about your domain model. How much of your domain model does this concept over here know? And contract coupling, the weakest form of coupling that we want to get to, is where each of your components has a very explicit API, and everything behind that API is free to evolve easily. So now, in a conversation, we can simply say, that's contract coupling. Dependencies and it doesn't change very often. That's not a problem. That's a dependency we can accept. We've got this language for talking about coupling. Something else Vladik talks about is local versus global complexity. How are we moving the complexity around in our system? If we have lots of smaller pieces, each smaller piece will be locally less complex, but the system globally will have more dependencies between more components, so the global complexity is higher. I would love to talk about these things more, but my key point is, if you're going to be designing these loosely coupled systems, you need to be able to talk about dependencies and coupling in a mature, adult manner. And these concepts that Vladik's been working on give us a way to have those useful conversations. So, I think modern architects are also letting the domain drive the architecture. We've talked about identifying domain boundaries, but as I talked about at Salesforce, the software should be aligned with those domain boundaries. And again, another problem I see as a consultant is, I'll be working with some developers and architects, and I'll just ask the question, like, let's start mapping out your system, talk about your system. And they'll be talking about names of databases and these technical names like cloud and Snowflake. I've got no idea what their system's doing. And the thing that worries me is, nor do they. They don't understand the domain concepts that their architect is representing. They're designing these systems in a very ad hoc technical manner. We can solve that problem very easily. Some simple modeling techniques out there. This one's called domain message flow modeling. So with this technique, we have some basic notation. We have subdomains, we have commands, we have queries, and we have events. In this particular example here, we've got the acquisition crew. So this is a company that sells cars online. The acquisition crew are some people who go out to auctions, and they will buy cars that they can sell on to customers later. Step one, they're using this tablet app. They send a query to the inspection subdomain. Get me the inspection details for this car I'm about to look at the auction. Step two is complete the inspection. Enter the details that I notice. You know, the car's got some scratches, this bit's broken, there's a stain on the seat, whatever. Just the inspection, here's the details of the inspection. They go to the inspection subdomain. Once the inspection's complete, the inspection subdomain raises an inspection completed event, which the purchasing advice subdomain is subscribing to and performing some further actions. So you can see here, we've described a system, we've described a software architecture using only domain terminology. The technical details are important, but at least we can talk about what the system is supposed to be doing from a business perspective. And sometimes that technical thinking is so ingrained, just to do one diagram like this takes hours. Like, people still keep trying to talk about databases and services. I'm like, yes, but what is happening in your domain? What does that data represent? What does that microservice represent? What business value does that provide? So the final point is, I think that modern architects use tools judiciously. So far, it's all been a bit fuzzy, arm-wavy, post-its on the wall, identifying these heuristics. But I think architecture can be data-driven, and I think tools do play a role in a modern context. But on one side, I see a lot of these enterprise architecture tools that don't really lead in a good direction. You get teams of architects who go away and build these models of the company and all the services, and I don't think that's providing any value. However, there are some tools that do provide value in this space, and basically anything with Adam Thornhill's name on it is something that you can trust. So here's one of his tools, CodeScene. This is an amazing tool that can give you some incredible insights about the coupling in your system. Just last week, a CTO who I'm working with, he started a new company, and he applied CodeScene to the company's code base, and he's like, wow, I think it was around 60% of the code was only worked on by contractors. If those contractors left, there will be 60% of their code that nobody in the company knows about, and that is I just find CodeScene an amazing tool. Don't have time to talk about that more, but I just want to say, in this vision of architecture I'm presenting, data is important. It's not all the arm waving and post-its. So that's basically it for the talk. Just want to clarify a couple of things about this journey we went on. I think the lion and the gymnast will be coming in very shortly, and I'll be doing a bit of that as well, so not long to go now. So basically, these three concepts need to be lined up. This was my big turning point in my career. Yes, we want to have loosely coupled architecture. Yes, we need to align the architecture with the business subdomains, but also teams are part of the picture. We have to think about the teams as well. We can't really design any two parts of that equation without thinking about the third part as well. Over the last couple of years, team topologies has come along, and I think the concept of the value stream, more specifically an independent value stream, is that building block that we need to be thinking about at all times now. That for me, is the building block of modern architecture. Now, it's not everything, it's not the only concept, but I think if you start with this in your mind as the fundamental building block of architecture, you won't have those big moments I had realizing, all these things fit together. You'll already have the four key concepts in your mind that you need to think about at all times. So domain aligned, outcome oriented, team empowered, and software decoupled. And yeah, I think if this is going to be our building block, if architecture is going to be about those independent value streams with these four different aspects, then a modern architect is really a dot connector from the business to the strategy to the teams and the software. That's a broad area of influence and knowledge that modern architects are operating in. So here are some of the things I mentioned during the talk. Skilled at identifying domain boundaries, knowing about which outcomes to optimize for, understanding how empowered teams work, and so on. And that's it. Just want to say thank you for joining me in this lovely circus. And I hope you've got a nice turning point coming up in your career.
Thank you very much, Nick. Very exciting talk. I told about quitting because I just quit my job 2 times, and that's the most amazing part of my career. You get to start something new. That's a great turning point.
Tell me about this. What happened after you quit your job? How did things improve? Let's focus on the positive aspects.
It's a really interesting process. Highly recommended to rethink. You get to refactor your life.
Liberating. You were like, I can do anything. Quit my job and I can go and run in a circus.
Not yet. First you are like, oh, what do I do with my life? And then you realize that during the last whatever years of your life, you did not think what's interesting for you or what good can you do, what excites you. And then you're like, oh, exciting things. And then it goes up. But first you need to plunge down a little bit more. Yeah. It's really hard, but it's
cool.
Rewarding.
So you're advising them all to quit their jobs? Right now. Send an email right now.
Right now, Bosch is hiring, No, I advise to take a little bit more time to reflect on what keeps you waking up every morning. Are you still excited about it? Okay. And not be driven by fear of, oh my God, I have to have a job just to pay my bills. It's important. Financial stability is important. But so is your well-being, physical, mental, etc.
So that stability is taken away, and it forces you to really think about,
Exactly. So you're like, reprogramming yourself for something. We have some nice questions, so I would read them out for you, and you feel free to answer or tell me, no, we skip this one.
Okay.
So, what would you suggest to architects if the top leadership wants multiple aspects, for example, quality improvement or cost cutting and market growth all at once?
Well, that's a very common scenario where leadership wants to, cut costs, deliver 20x more products, and improve quality at the same time. And I think that's where facilitating gatherings is important. I've done a talk about this at NDC earlier in the year, which you can check out on my website. But basically, I think it's about designing meetings and workshops to bring people together to surface these issues. There's a whole range of techniques out there, using questionnaires and surveys. But effectively, I think it's about bringing the groups together, acting as a facilitator, bringing the different stakeholders together to try and get them to share their thoughts and get them aligned. And if they're still saying things afterwards, then I guess you need to be a bit more honest about what's possible. Using techniques like a core domain chart, you can say, we're going to be focusing on these 4 different core domains here, and that's going to require a significant investment. So I think turning into some numbers at that point. So I guess, to summarize, facilitation, trying to get the different stakeholders aligned, maybe that's the concern. Different stakeholders want different things. And if that doesn't work, some kind of visual techniques to explain why they're asking for too much.
All right, thank you. As an architect, how do motivate team, I need more coffee. How do you motivate teams, dev teams?
You're not going to quit, are you?
What?
You said you like quitting. You're not going to quit, are you? You can do this.
Yes. So, wish me luck. As an architect, how do you motivate dev teams to take ownership of the architecture, e.g. draw diagrams, and do not expect the architect to make the decisions? You got the question?
Yeah, so there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. It can be, you know, what's the company incentivizing and what are the individuals expecting? I've worked with architects, developers who like to take on these responsibilities. They just feel stifled by architects who won't let them. And in some situations, it's the other way around. The company's looking for people to take on more architectural responsibility, but it's the developers themselves who just like, I'm happy taking Jira tickets and just working on tickets. That's my thing. So I guess on one aspect, I guess it starts from hiring the right people with the right mindset. I think there's having one-to-one conversations with the individuals, you know, like what we're trying to get to is we want teams to take on more architectural responsibility. I'm doing a workshop in a couple of weeks about this. A new CTO is joining the company. He wants to move towards more empowered teams. And so we're having this 4-day workshop, getting together in Canada to try and let the CTO put his vision out there and design some workshops and activities around that. And I think this concept of getting together in person, having some big workshops, and the CTO or some senior leader saying, look, I want you to work this way. I want you to take more decisions in your teams. I want you to be more responsible. I think that's really powerful when they can see that the company is incentivizing them to take on more responsibility. I think that's the key in my experience.
Great, thank you very much. Let's take the last one. What do companies/architects usually get wrong when implementing these concepts?
Ooh, the first thing that comes to my mind is probably companies expecting results too quickly. You know, it's going to take a long time to migrate from where you are now to where you want to get to. As I talked about before, there's the legacy architecture, and there's also the organizational teams that have been formed maybe over years. And migrating to something that looks different, the way things are organized differently, can take time. Recently, for example, someone said, so after these 4-day workshops, we're going to have a whole new organization structure done, and there won't be any more workshops, will there? You know, that kind of expectation is quite common. Or I think people are always looking for that quick fix. Like, we've spent the last 10 years building up all this technical debt and the way the organization works. It's going to take 3 years to fix it. No, there must be a quicker way. There must be some short-term solution. But, you know, migrating from the current to the target takes a long time. So I think expectations and being prepared for that journey and not looking for quick fixes, that's my most common experience.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you so much for coming today. Let's give a warm hand to Nick.